The day Alice Gentry stepped off the stage in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1873, every man within earshot made the same quiet wager. She would be gone before the first frost. She arrived with a carpetbag in one hand and a surveyor's map in the other, her dark hair pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days, her eyes the color of creek water under an open sky green with hints of gray and gold, the kind of eyes that could be calm one moment and stormy the next. She wore practical boots, not the fashionable buttoned kind the women back in Cincinnati favored, but thick-soled, leather-worn boots meant for walking ground that didn't care how pretty you were. She was 23 years old, recently widowed after only 4 months of marriage to a man named Thomas Gentry, who had died of fever before he ever set foot on the land he had staked a claim to in the southwestern Kansas territory. Alice had received 2 letters from Thomas while he traveled west ahead of her. The third letter that arrived was from a stranger informing her that her husband was dead. She had 2 choices. She could sell the land claim and go back to Cincinnati, where her mother and her 3 unmarried sisters waited with sympathy and hot tea. Or she could go west and see what Thomas had staked his life upon. She looked at that map for 3 days in the small Cincinnati parlor where she had grown up, and on the 4th day she packed her bags. Her father had called her too headstrong. Her mother had wept. Her older sister Margaret had gripped her arm at the door and said, in that particular tone women use when they are trying to sound practical rather than afraid, "Alice, you will not last a season out there. No woman alone lasts a season." Alice had kissed her sister's cheek, picked up her carpetbag, and walked out into the morning like she owned it. Caldwell was loud in the way that frontier towns are loud, not the organized noise of city life, but the scattered, improvisational noise of a place still figuring out what it was. There were cattle men and buffalo hunters and settlers passing through with their wagons loaded high, and saloons that started their business before noon, and a single dry goods store run by a man named Hodges who watched Alice step down from the stage with the expression of a man watching a pretty canary try to land in a windstorm. "You lost, miss," Hodges called out from his porch. "Not yet," Alice said and kept walking. She arranged for a horse at the livery stable, a steady brown mare she named Patience, because she suspected she would need a great deal of that particular virtue in the weeks ahead. The land Thomas had claimed was 40 miles southwest of Caldwell, near a dry creek bed called Sallow Creek, which did not sound promising but which the surveyor's map indicated had spring-fed water below the surface and good grass for grazing. Thomas had been a dreamer, but he had also been a careful reader of land surveys, and Alice had trusted his instincts when he was alive. She saw no reason to stop trusting them now that he was gone. She rode Patience out of Caldwell on a Tuesday morning, her carpetbag strapped to the back of the saddle, and a second bag with provisions hanging from the pommel. She had a pistol she had borrowed from her father's desk drawer back in Cincinnati, a Navy Colt that was older than her marriage and heavier than it looked. She did not know with any great confidence that she could hit what she aimed at, but she figured the existence of the pistol was more important than the accuracy of whoever held it. The land between Caldwell and Sallow Creek was something she was not prepared for, not truly, not in the way that preparation means having felt something before. The prairie stretched out in every direction like a sentence that refused to end. The sky was enormous, indifferent, beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. The grass rolled in slow waves under the wind, and occasionally a hawk turned lazy circles overhead, and the silence was the kind of silence that is actually full of small sounds, insects and wind, and the creak of leather, and the soft percussion of Patience's hooves on the packed earth. Alice had grown up near the Ohio River and was accustomed to trees. Here trees were events, you noted them, you were grateful for them. She made camp the first night beside a cluster of cottonwoods near a shallow stream, and she did not sleep well, but she slept, which she counted as a victory. On the afternoon of the second day she found Sallow Creek, and she found Thomas's claim, and she sat on Patience at the edge of the property for a long time without moving. It was good land. She could see that even without being a farmer. The grass was deep and thick, the color of old gold in the late afternoon light, and the creek bed, while dry on the surface, had dark, damp soil underneath that spoke of water. There was a low rise to the west that would break the worst of the wind. The horizon was clean and wide, and the air smelled of prairie sage. She dismounted slowly, walked to the center of the property, drove the toe of her boot into the soil, and looked at what she had come 3 days to find. "All right, Thomas," she said quietly to the sky. "I see why you wanted this." Then she got back on her horse and rode toward the nearest neighbor, which the surveyor's map indicated was a working cattle ranch 3 miles north, belonging to a man whose name was listed on the county plat as A. Wilcox. The Wilcox Ranch was not large by the standards of the bigger Texas operations that were pushing up into Kansas, but it was solid in the way that things built by steady hands over several years become solid. There was a proper barn with a hay loft and a paddock fence that had been repaired more than once and would be repaired again. There was a main house of rough lumber with a covered porch that faced south, and a bunkhouse behind it, and a kitchen garden that surprised her neat rows of something green and determined pushing up along the south wall. There were horses in the paddock, 4 of them, and in the distance a small herd of cattle moved slowly across a slope. Alice rode up to the house and called out before she dismounted, as was proper. A man came around the side of the barn wiping his hands on a piece of cloth. He was 30 years old, though she would not learn his exact age until later, and he was the kind of man the frontier produced when it was inclined to be generous, tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and hands that showed work and brown hair that had been lightened at the temples by the Kansas sun. He wore a plain cotton shirt, suspenders, worn denim trousers, and boots that were caked with barn mud. He had a calm face, the kind of face that did not rush to expression, and dark eyes that took her in with a measuring quality that was not impolite, just thorough. "Afternoon," he said. "Good afternoon," Alice said from the saddle. "I am looking for A. Wilcox." "You found him," the man said. "Albert Wilcox, and you would be Alice Gentry. I hold the claim to the Gentry parcel 3 miles south of here. I arrived yesterday." Albert Wilcox looked at her for a moment, then looked south in the direction of the Gentry parcel, then looked back at her. He did not say anything rude or dismissive, which she noted and appreciated. "Alone," he said. "As you see," Alice said. He seemed to consider this, and then he nodded once like something had been filed away. "You had supper," he said. "I have provisions," Alice said. "That is not what I asked," Albert said. She looked at him. He was not smiling exactly, but there was something in his expression that was not unfriendly. She had been in the saddle for 2 days and had eaten hard biscuits and dried beef, and she was, in fact, quite hungry. "No," she admitted. "I have not had proper supper." "Come down off that horse," he said. "I have a pot of something on." She tied Patience at the paddock fence and followed Albert Wilcox into his kitchen, which was plain and clean and smelled of onions and wood smoke. He poured coffee without being asked and set a bowl of beef and vegetable stew in front of her that tasted better than anything she could remember eating in recent memory, which she suspected had something to do with hunger, and also with the fact that the stew was genuinely good. "You cook your own meals?" she asked. "I have a man, Eli, who does for me 3 days a week," Albert said, pouring his own coffee and settling into the chair across the table. "Otherwise, yes. Most ranchers I have heard of rely entirely on hired cooks." "Most ranchers have more ranch hands than I do," Albert said without apology, "and I did not come west to pay other people to do what I can do myself." She ate, and he drank his coffee and asked her, in a careful and measured way that she appreciated, the particulars of how she had come to be sitting alone in a Kansas ranch kitchen in the spring of 1873. She told him about Thomas and the claim and Cincinnati and the map. She did not cry, which she had been doing intermittently since Thomas's death, but her voice was level in the particular way of a woman who has cried enough for a while and does not have anything left at the moment. Albert listened to all of it, When she finished, he said, "I am sorry about your husband." "Thank you," Alice said. "What is your intention with the land?" he said. "I intend to work it," Alice said. He looked at her steadily. "That is a serious undertaking. I am a serious person." "I can see that," Albert said, and he said it with an evenness that she could not quite read, not condescension, not disbelief, something more like acknowledgement that he was still processing what she had told him. "Have you farmed before?" "I have kept a kitchen garden," Alice said, "and I know what it is to work hard. I learn quickly." "A kitchen garden and a homestead claim are not the same thing," he said. "No," she agreed. "They are not. But a person who has never done something before is not the same as a person who cannot do it." He was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee cup. Then he said, "No, I suppose not." She slept that night in the small spare room Albert offered without ceremony, the kind of offer made on the frontier where hospitality is a survival courtesy rather than a social one. In the morning she rode back south to the Gentry claim and she began. The first month was the hardest thing she had ever done in her life. There was no structure on the land, nothing Thomas had managed to build before he died. She lived in a tent she had brought rolled behind the saddle, which was adequate in dry weather and miserable in rain. She began digging a root cellar herself because the roots of a house begin underground, and because she needed a place to store what she intended to grow before the frosts came. She hauled water from the damp hollow of the creek bed in buckets until she found the right place to dig a proper well. She planted what she could: corn, beans, squash, in the rich dark soil near the creek hollow, and she watched the sky with the attentiveness of someone who has learned very quickly that weather on the open prairie is not a background event but a central character. Albert Wilcox appeared on the third day. He rode down with a spare post-hole digger and a coil of rope, and he did not explain himself, just tied his horse and began working beside her without preamble, the way men on the frontier sometimes helped each other because the frontier was bigger than any one person's pride. "You do not have to do this," she said. "I know," he said. She let him help. After a while she said, "Why are you here, Mr. Wilcox?" He drove the post-hole digger into the earth and said, without looking at her, "Because you are going to need a fence before you need anything else, and digging post holes alone is a misery." "I meant, why are you helping me?" she said. "I am a stranger." "You are a neighbor," he said. "Out here that is not nothing." They worked through the morning and into the afternoon. He left before supper, riding back north without fanfare. He came back 2 days later, and then 3 days after that, and then, by some unspoken agreement that evolved over the course of the first few weeks, he came most mornings when he could spare the hours from his own cattle work, and they built things together. He was quiet in a way she came to appreciate deeply. He did not fill silences with empty talk, but neither was he remote. When he spoke, it was usually useful, about the land, about weather signs, about which neighbors could be trusted for trade and which could not, about the habits of the creek and the direction of the worst winds. He taught her to read the sky for coming storms and to check the grass stalks for certain insects that indicated changing moisture. He brought her extra seed from his own stores without comment. She repaid what she could. Once with a repaired shirt she had seen hanging on his fence line with a torn seam, which she mended and returned without remark. Once with a jar of the dried herbs she had hung in her tent that she knew he had run low on. They had the careful politeness of two people who are both sensible and lonely, which is to say they spoke to each other with a formality that was slowly, incrementally, becoming something warmer without either of them quite naming it. By the end of the first summer she had a one-room house of her own. It was not large, but it was hers, built with her own hands and Albert's, and 2 men she had hired for a week with money she had brought from Cincinnati. She had a well, a root cellar, a kitchen garden that had produced well enough to give her something to store, and a growing sense that she was not going to fail. She was sunburned and calloused, and she had lost 5 pounds and found a strength in her shoulders she had not known she possessed, and she was, privately, deeply satisfied. She also knew, by September, that she thought about Albert Wilcox more than was strictly useful. It was not an immediate thing, not one of those sudden reversals of feeling that happen in romantic novels. It was gradual and quiet and honest, the way real affections develop between people who are too sensible to rush. She noticed the particular way he moved, economical and unhurried, saving effort for what mattered. She noticed how he laughed, which was not often but was completely genuine when it happened, a sudden brightness in his usually composed face that made her want to say something amusing just to see it again. She noticed that he asked her opinion on things, on the weather, on a trade he was considering, on a piece of equipment, and that he listened to her answers with real attention, which was not something she had always been given, back in Cincinnati or anywhere else. She also noticed, though she tried not to dwell on it, that he looked at her sometimes in a way that made her feel seen, not appraised, not evaluated but truly seen, which was different and more important. She told herself it was practical. They were neighbors. They relied on each other. That was the frontier. She told herself this very firmly, quite often. In October, a man arrived from Caldwell to survey additional land adjacent to Alice's claim. His name was Porter, and he was from a land office back east with a long record of dubious practices, and he informed Alice, with the oiled smoothness of a man accustomed to being believed, that there was a question about the validity of her late husband's claim, that there had been an error in the original filing that could require her to refile, which would mean the land reverted to unclaimed status during the period of refiling, which would mean that anyone with an interest could stake a competing claim. Alice stood on her own porch and listened to all of this and felt a cold, distinct fury settle behind her eyes. "I have the original claim documents," she said. "Ma'am, the issue is procedural," Porter said smoothly. "The issue," Alice said, "is that you have come here to tell me my land is not my land. I will ride to Caldwell tomorrow morning and speak to the county land office directly." Porter's smile faltered slightly. "That is certainly your right." "Yes," Alice said, "it is." She rode to Caldwell the next morning. She left before dawn and she rode hard. She had her documents. She also had a letter she had written the previous evening to a land attorney in Wichita, whose name had been given to her by Hodges, the dry goods store man, who was considerably more useful than he appeared. Albert had appeared that morning as she was saddling Patience in the pre-dawn dark, and she had not been surprised to see him, which said something. "I heard about Porter," he said. "Word travels," she said, tightening a cinch strap. "He has done this before," Albert said. "In the Caldwell territory, he finds widows and single women holding claims and he challenges the filings." Alice straightened and looked at him. "What happened to the others?" Albert's jaw tightened slightly. "Some of them left." "I am not leaving," Alice said. "I know," he said. She rode to Caldwell. She spent 4 hours at the county land office, where a clerk named Dawson initially tried to dismiss her with the particular impatience of men who cannot imagine a woman understanding paperwork. She was patient and precise, and she put her documents on his desk one at a time in the correct order, and she cited the relevant sections of the Kansas Homestead Act of 1862, which she had read thoroughly in Cincinnati before she ever packed a bag, and she did not raise her voice, because she had learned early in life that a raised voice gives people permission to dismiss you as emotional, while a perfectly level voice keeps them accountable to reason. By the time she left the land office, her claim was confirmed and a formal note had been sent to Porter's supervising office in Topeka. She stopped at Hodges's store to send a letter to the Wichita attorney anyway, because she believed in closing all the doors through which trouble might re-enter. She rode back to Sallow Creek in the early evening, and Albert Wilcox was sitting on the step of her porch, his hat on his knee, waiting. "Well," he said. "It is confirmed," she said, dismounting. He exhaled slowly, and the relief on his face was more visible than she had expected, which made something shift quietly in her chest. "Good," he said, and then, because he was Albert and he expressed things sideways, "I brought more fence posts. I noticed the south line needs another 20 feet. She looked at him, at this man sitting on her step in the cooling prairie evening with his hat on his knee and his brown eyes warm in the low light, and she said, "Thank you for more than the fence posts." "I know what you meant," he said quietly. They sat on the porch steps in the fading light and they talked, more than they usually did. The kind of talking that happens between people after a hard day when defenses are lower, and the relief of a good outcome has loosened something. She asked him about his own path west, which she had not fully heard before. He had come from Indiana, not quite 10 years earlier, in 1864, when he was 20 years old and the war was eating young men, and he had managed to avoid the worst of it by being already west of the main theaters and working a cattle drive north from Texas. He had taken his wages from 2 seasons of drives and bought his first 40 acres, and he had added to it slowly, methodically, not with ambition for greatness, but with the conviction that if you did the work correctly and saved what you earned, you would eventually have something solid. "You never wanted to go back east?" Alice asked. "No," Albert said simply. "This is where I belong." "How do you know that?" she said. "How does a person know that about a place?" He thought about this for a moment in the serious way he thought about things. "I suppose," he said finally, "that I knew it when I stopped looking at the horizon thinking about somewhere else and started looking at it thinking about what I could build here." She was quiet with that for a while, watching the last light drain out of the western sky. "I think I am beginning to feel that way," she said, "about this place." "Good," Albert said, and it was simple and genuine, and she felt it like warm light against her skin. She lasted the first winter. It was a hard winter, the kind that the Kansas plains produce with no apology. In December, the temperature dropped below zero for 2 weeks running, and the wind came across the open land with a ferocity that made the walls of her small house shake. She had laid in wood and food, and she had insulated the walls with sod and straw the way Albert had shown her, and she burned wood carefully, and wore everything she owned in layers and fed patients twice a day, and kept her own hands busy to keep her mind from dwelling on the cold. Albert checked on her twice in December, riding the 3 miles south when the weather allowed a day of passage. He brought extra firewood the second time, dragged on a sledge behind his horse, and when she tried to argue about paying for it, he simply began stacking it against the side of her house without responding to the argument, which made her simultaneously exasperated and deeply moved. She cooked him a meal those nights he came. She was a good cook. She had learned it properly, not as decoration but as craft, and she made cornbread and salt pork and whatever vegetables remained from her root cellar, and he ate with the appreciation of a man who lived mostly alone and did not often eat well. They talked for hours those winter evenings, sitting by the small iron stove with cups of coffee that slowly went cold as they forgot to drink them. She learned that he had a sister in Indiana named Clara who wrote him letters that he kept in a wooden box under his bed. She learned that he had tried to keep a dog once, which had been bitten by a rattlesnake in his second summer, and that he had not tried again. She learned that he was quiet not from shyness, but from a deep preference for meaning what he said, which meant he chose his words carefully rather than spending them freely. She told him about Thomas, really about Thomas, not just the facts of the death but the life before, the man who had been sweet and a little impractical but genuinely kind, who had loved books and had terrible handwriting, and had cried at the birth of a neighbor's new baby in a way that embarrassed him and had charmed her enormously. She had not talked about Thomas in this way to anyone since his death, and she found, unexpectedly, that talking about him did not hurt the way it used to, but had taken on the cleaner ache of true grief, the kind that has processed itself through the body and has become more memory than wound. Albert listened to all of it without hurrying her or flinching from the sadness in it. When she was done, he said, "He sounds like a good man." "He was," Alice said. "He was a very good man." There was a small silence, and then Albert said, "He would have been glad to know you came." She looked up at him, surprised by the tenderness of this. His expression was open in a way he did not often allow it, the careful composure softened into something more vulnerable and real. "I believe he would have been," she said softly. Spring came. In 1874, Alice planted her first full season of crops, and they grew. She planted corn and beans and squash in the large bottom field near the creek, and a kitchen garden beside the house of herbs and root vegetables. And she planted a small orchard of 3 young apple trees she had brought as saplings wrapped in wet burlap from Caldwell, not because she expected them to produce quickly, but because she intended to be there when they did. That same spring, 2 other families settled on land east of the Gentry claim. The Marshalls, a husband, wife, and 4 children, and the Hennessy family, recently arrived from Missouri. Alice brought cornbread to both families within the week of their arrival, as Albert had once brought wood to her. She sat at Hester Marshall's kitchen table, while Hester's youngest daughter pulled at her skirt hem, and she gave Hester the particular advice she wished she had been given in her own first days, about the water below the dry creek bed, about the wind direction, about the way the soil needed to be worked before it could be planted, about which men in Caldwell were honest and which were not. Albert teased her gently about becoming the unofficial authority on the territory. "Someone has to be," she said. "I believe you are right," he said, and the way he said it with that warm undercurrent of real admiration that was not flattery made her flush slightly, which she hoped he did not notice. He noticed. She could tell from the way he looked down at his coffee cup. By summer of 1874, there were enough families within a 5-mile radius of Sallow Creek that the question of a post office became practical. Alice wrote the letter to the county office herself, drafted carefully at her kitchen table on 3 successive evenings, and rewritten twice until it was exactly right. She listed the population, the geographic considerations, the nearest existing post office and its distance, the frequency of supply wagons through the area, and the specific economic benefits of a formal postal designation to both the settlers and the county. She sent it to Caldwell and also to Wichita, because she believed in the post office strategy she had developed regarding land disputes, which was to send things to multiple authorities simultaneously. The post office was approved in the fall. The county asked for a local postmaster. Alice nominated Albert, who accepted with the particular combination of reluctance and dependability she had come to know as his fundamental character. "You should be postmaster," he said. "You wrote the letter. You have the barn," she said. "It is the most central building with actual storage space." He looked at her. "You want the post to come through my barn. I want it to come through the most practical location," she said. "Which is your barn, unless you would prefer I build a proper post office building." He looked at her for a moment with something she was starting to recognize as barely suppressed amusement. "I will be postmaster," he said, "on the condition that you serve as my deputy." "There is no such position," Alice said. "There is now," he said. She became his deputy postmaster, which was an entirely unofficial role that meant she sorted the mail when it arrived, kept the records in the ledger she had acquired for the purpose, and handled the correspondence with the Caldwell office that Albert, who was a man of few written words, found laborious. She did not mind. She liked correspondence. It was during the fall of 1874 that things changed between them, slowly and then all at once, in the way that things change when 2 people have been honest with each other long enough that pretending becomes not just impossible but absurd. It happened first in October, when a grass fire moved across the low hills west of the Marshall property. Grass fires were not uncommon in the dry fall season, and the community had an informal arrangement to respond together, which meant that when smoke was spotted on the western horizon at 4 in the afternoon, every family within sight was on horseback within 20 minutes. Alice rode out with a wet blanket over Patience's neck and a shovel strapped to her saddle, which was the standard equipment. She had helped with a smaller fire the previous year and knew what was required. Albert found her in the line of beaters 300 yards from where the fire was moving through the dry grass in a low rolling wave ahead of the wind. He appeared at her left side on his bay gelding, which he called nothing in particular, but which responded to a clicking sound he made with his teeth. They worked side by side for 3 hours, beating the fire's edge with wet blankets and shovel-turned soil, and the kind of focused physical labor that strips away everything inessential and leaves only the task and the person beside you. The smoke was thick and acrid, and her eyes burned, and her arms ached from the shoulders, and the heat of the fire was a physical presence on her face. At one point the wind shifted, and the fire moved faster to the north, and Albert caught her arm and pulled her back, and they ran together for 30 yards before stopping and reassessing. He kept his hand on her arm for a moment after they stopped, and she could feel each of his fingers through her sleeve, and the sensation was so specific and present that she could not have said afterward what the fire was doing. "All right," he said, looking at her in the smoke-filtered afternoon light with an intensity that had nothing to do with the fire. "Yes," she said. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds, which is a long time when two people are being honest. Then the wind shifted back and they turned to the fire again. The fire was contained before dark. The Marshall property lost a section of fence and some outbuildings, but the house and barn were saved, and the community gathered afterward at the Marshall place with food and water, and the particular exhausted relief of people who have averted a disaster together. Hester Marshall pressed Alice's hands in both of hers and could not speak, and Alice said it was nothing, which it was not. Albert rode beside her on the way home. The night was cool, and the stars were extraordinary, the way the Kansas sky in fall produces stars that seem to be in competition for density. They rode mostly in silence, because they were tired and because neither of them needed to fill the silence anymore. At the junction where the trail split toward his ranch and toward her homestead, they slowed and stopped. "Alice," Albert said. She looked at him in the dark. His face was ash-smudged and serious, and there was something in his expression she had seen building for months like weather on the horizon, and she felt in her chest the particular suspended feeling of standing at the edge of something significant. "Yes," she said. "I have been," he started, and then stopped, and started again in the careful way he had with things that mattered. "I have been not saying something for a considerable length of time." "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You know what it is." "I believe I do," she said. The silence stretched, not uncomfortably but waitfully, in the way of silences that contain the whole of two people's history with each other. "I would like to say it," he said. "Then say it," she said softly. "I am in love with you," Albert Wilcox said, in the direct and unadorned way of a man who had taken months to say a thing and was not about to hedge it once he started. "I have been for some time. I did not say it before because I did not think the timing was right, and because I did not want to make your life harder than it already was, and because," he paused, and for the first time since she had known him, he seemed genuinely uncertain, "because I was afraid you would leave." The last part surprised her enough that she was quiet for a moment. The stars wheeled slowly overhead and the horses shifted their weight and the prairie breathed its dark autumnal breath around them. "I told you," she said. "I am not leaving. You told me that about Porter," he said. "Albert," she said, and the way his name sounded in her own voice told her something she had known for a while and had not yet said aloud. "I have been in love with you since the winter, possibly since the fall. I have been not saying it for almost the same length of time and for almost the same reasons." He looked at her, and she watched his face change in the darkness, the careful composure of it opening into something unguarded and real and beautiful. "Is that right?" he said, and it was not quite a question. "That is exactly right," she said. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm and certain against hers, and she held on to him in the dark Kansas night with the stars blazing overhead and the smell of smoke still in both their hair, and she thought, "This is the place where I belong. Not just this land, but this moment, and this man, and this life I have been building." They married in April of 1875. The wedding was held at the Marshall property, which had the largest gathering space available. Hester Marshall organized the food with the particular focused generosity of a woman who expresses love through feeding people, and the result was an extraordinary spread of dishes that the community contributed, plates carried in from every homestead and ranch within riding distance. There was music. A fiddle player named Connors who worked on one of the larger cattle operations to the north, and who played old tunes and new ones with equal enthusiasm. There was dancing on a flat stretch of ground that had been smoothed with boards, and children ran between the adults' legs, and the evening was warm and scented with spring grass and wood smoke, and the sweet particular smell of the prairie after the rains. Alice wore a dress she had made herself from blue cotton she had ordered from Hodges's store months earlier, not wedding white because she was a practical woman and blue was a color she would wear again. She pinned her hair up with the silver pins that had been her mother's, the only jewelry she owned that was purely decorative, and when she walked across the grass toward Albert, she saw the way he looked at her and thought she might carry the memory of that look for the rest of her life. He was clean-shaved and wearing his best shirt, which she had helped him press that morning at his ranch kitchen with a flat iron heated on the stove, and he stood tall and steady in the way he always stood, like the land itself, like something that had been there before and would be there after, and when she reached him, he took her hand with the same certainty he had reached for it in the dark that October night. "You look remarkable," he said quietly, just for her. "You look rather well yourself," she said. The justice of the peace who had ridden out from Caldwell for the occasion read the legal words, and when Albert said his promises his voice was low and deliberate and clear, the way he said everything that mattered. When Alice said hers, she looked directly at him, because she had decided that if you were making promises, you should look at the person you were making them to. They danced 3 times, which was 3 more times than Albert typically danced, and he was not a graceful dancer, but he was an earnest one, and she loved him for the earnestness of it, the willingness to do an uncomfortable thing because it made her happy. Connors played a slow tune near the end of the evening, and Albert held her close in the firelight, and they moved together in a way that had less to do with dancing and more to do with simply being in each other's arms for the first time in the formal sense. And she rested her cheek against his shoulder, and felt the warmth of him and the steadiness of his heartbeat, and thought there was no better place in the world. They rode home together after midnight, side by side in the moonlight, and the prairie stretched away in every direction in the silver dark, enormous and quiet and theirs. The years that followed were full. Albert moved his operations south, combining his cattle ranch with Alice's growing homestead property in a formal arrangement that made practical sense, and that also meant, as Alice noted with satisfaction, that her original land claim was now the center of something larger rather than a lone outpost. They added to the house first, a second room, then a third, then a covered porch across the south-facing front that Alice had wanted since the first year she arrived. They lost a crop to drought in the summer of 1876 and recovered it through cattle sales and Alice's stores. They had their first disagreement about money that fall, a real disagreement that lasted 3 days and included 2 meals eaten in silence and one evening where Alice walked out to the creek bed by herself and sat in the dark and thought hard thoughts and came back ready to continue the conversation with more patience than she had left the table with. Albert met her on the porch when she returned and said, in his particular sideways way, "I believe I may have been too inflexible on the grain matter." "I believe I may have been too quick to press the point," Alice said. They went inside and talked it through properly, and reached an agreement that was better than either of their original positions, which is what happens when 2 stubborn, intelligent people argue honestly. In 1877, their son was born. They named him Thomas, for Alice's first husband, which was Albert's suggestion, offered quietly over supper one evening when she was 7 months along, and they had been discussing names. She had looked at him across the table and felt a love for him so large she could not immediately speak. "Are you certain?" she said. "He was a good man who brought you here," Albert said simply. "I think he deserves remembering." Thomas Wilcox was born on a February morning with the temperature below freezing, and Hester Marshall serving as midwife with the calm efficiency of a woman who had birthed 4 children of her own and assisted at 6 more. He was loud and pink and had Alice's gray-green eyes and Albert's stubbornness, which became evident within hours and persisted for his entire childhood, and she suspected, his entire life. Albert held his son for the first time standing at the window of their bedroom with the cold February light coming in pale and clear, and Alice watched him from the bed and saw something happen in his face that she had never seen before, a depth of emotion that even his considerable reserve could not contain, a softening that made him look younger and more open than she had ever seen him, and his eyes when he looked at her over the baby's head were shining. "He is quite remarkable," Albert said. "He is screaming," Alice observed. "Remarkably loudly," Albert said. She laughed, which hurt but which was worth it. By 1878, Sallow Creek, as the settlement had been informally called since the early days, had enough residents to justify more than a post office. There were 17 families within a 5-mile radius. There was a need for a proper general store, for a schoolhouse, for a more reliable water infrastructure than each family's individual well. Alice had been thinking about these things for 2 years, not idly but with the systematic attention she gave to anything she intended to act on. She raised the schoolhouse question at a community meeting held in Albert's barn, which had become the default gathering space since the post office had been there long enough to lend the barn a community feeling. 43 adults attended. She presented the case for a school with the same methodical precision she had used in the land office in 1873, laying out the number of school-age children in the settlement, the distance to the nearest existing school, the materials needed, the labor required, the precedent set by other Kansas settlements, and the specific benefits both immediate and long-term. There was disagreement about funding, which she had expected. A man named Culver, who had the largest land holding east of the creek, argued that pooled community funds were an imposition on individual settlers. Alice listened to this argument carefully and then said, "Mr. Culver, your children will receive the same education as everyone else's, which will be no education at all if we do not build a school." Culver frowned. "I can educate my own children. Can you teach them to read Latin?" said a voice from the back, which was Connors, the fiddle player, who had recently filed a land claim of his own and attended every community meeting. There was scattered laughter. Culver's expression softened slightly, which was the frontier equivalent of conceding a point. The vote was 37-6 in favor of the school. The schoolhouse went up in September of 1878, a proper timber frame building on a central lot that Alice had quietly identified as the ideal location 2 years earlier and had arranged through the county office to be designated as community land. She found the teacher herself, a young woman named Miss Calloway from Wichita who had her teacher's certificate and who was, Alice thought, exactly the right combination of firm and genuinely warm for children on the frontier who needed both. Albert, who had watched all of this with the quiet appreciation of a man who knows exactly who he is married to, told her one evening that she had a gift for knowing what a place needed before the place knew it needed it. "I just pay attention," she said. "Most people look at what is already there," he said. "You look at what could be." She thought about this. "Thomas used to say I saw too much," she said, "that it made me restless." "It does not make you restless," Albert said. "It makes you build things." She looked at him across the supper table with their son asleep in the next room and the fire warm in the iron stove and the prairie dark and quiet outside, and she thought she had never been given a better compliment in her life. In 1879, she applied to the county for official town designation for the Sallow Creek settlement. The application required a minimum population, a formal town plan, designated public spaces, and supporting documentation. She had been preparing this documentation for 6 months. She had drawn the town plan herself, with Albert's help on the surveying measurements, And it was not a rough sketch but a proper scaled drawing showing streets and lots and the designated spaces for school, post office, commercial district, and residential areas. The county sent a surveyor in October. His name was Mr. Bain, and he was 30 years younger than his skepticism suggested, and he arrived expecting, she suspected, something half-organized and provisional, and he found instead her careful documentation and the town plan and 43 family representatives waiting to answer his questions. When he asked who had prepared the application, he was directed to Alice. "You are the postmaster's wife," he said. "I am Albert Wilcox's wife," Alice said, "and I prepared the application. Do you have questions about the content?" Bain had questions. She answered all of them. Official town designation was granted in January of 1880, and the settlement was recorded in the county books as Gentry, Kansas. She had not suggested the name herself. It had been Albert who wrote it in the application, in the space for the proposed town name, while she was in the next room putting Thomas to bed. When she came back to the table and saw what he had written, she stood very still for a moment. "Albert," she said. "It should have your name," he said, not looking up from the papers. "You built it." "We built it," she said, "all of us, all the families." "You organized all the families," he said. "There is a difference." She sat down. The fire crackled. Thomas had gone to sleep easily tonight for once, and the house was quiet. "There were people here before me," she said slowly. "You were here before me." "And I have been here 3 miles north running cattle," Albert said, looking up now, his dark eyes direct and sure, "while you have been here building a town. The name is right." She did not argue further, because he was not a man who said things he did not mean, and because she knew, in the same honest way she knew most things, that he was right. Gentry, Kansas. She turned the name over in her mind and felt something she could not quite name, not pride exactly, because pride was too small, but something more like the specific satisfaction of a sentence finally completed, of a thing long intended that had finally arrived at its shape. She was 29 years old. She had been on the frontier for 6 years. She had outlasted the first frost and the first winter and the land dispute and the drought and the grass fire and the disagreement about money and the 1,000 other small erosions and harder ones. And she had built, from raw prairie and a dead man's claim and her own stubborn refusal to be smaller than the land required, something that now had a name and a school and a post office and a town plan on a county surveyor's map. The second decade was the decade of consolidation, which sounds less dramatic than the first decade, but was in its own way more complex. Gentry, Kansas grew steadily through the early 1880s. The general store came in 1880, run by a couple named the Stearns who had come up from the Texas Panhandle, and who stocked, to everyone's considerable satisfaction, a wider range of dry goods than Caldwell had offered the settlers who had been riding 40 miles for supplies. A church went up in 1881, and then a second church 6 months later when it became clear that the first congregation's theology was incompatible with 2/3 of the town, which Alice navigated diplomatically by chairing the committee that designated both buildings as community property, and negotiated a shared-use agreement that annoyed both congregations equally and therefore satisfied everyone just enough. Their daughter was born in 1882. They named her Clara, for Albert's sister in Indiana, and she came into the world with considerably more composure than Thomas had managed, looking around the room with an expression of calm assessment that Alice recognized as her father's. Clara was quiet in the way Albert was quiet, observant, deliberate, economical with her attention, and was, from her earliest years, entirely unafraid of anything, which gratified and terrified Alice in roughly equal measure. Albert had begun, by 1882, to serve on the informal county council that the settled territories used for collective governance before formal county structures caught up with the population. He attended meetings in Caldwell and occasionally in Wichita, and he was listened to with the respect given to men who have been in a place long enough and worked it hard enough that their opinion carries the weight of experience. He came home from these meetings and told Alice everything, not just the outcome but the texture of the conversations, the alliances and complications, the things that were not said but were meant. She was his sharpest counsel, and he knew it. In 1883, a drought year, a cattle baron named Morrison tried to run a large herd across the Gentry town land, claiming traditional cattle trail rights that predated the settlement. This created a genuine crisis, because Morrison's herd, which numbered in the thousands, would have destroyed the crops of 6 families and damaged the water supply that the town had spent 3 years developing from the Sallow Creek aquifer. Alice went to Caldwell with documentation about the town's legal designation and a letter from the county land office, and she sat across the table from Morrison himself, a man in his 50s, with the particular confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted by force of personality and economic weight. She was 33 years old and she was not afraid of him, which she could see surprised him slightly. She laid out the legal position simply and factually. The town's designation predated his claimed trail rights. The county had jurisdiction. His herd would not cross Gentry land. Mrs. Wilcox, Morrison said, with the kind of tolerance that is actually a form of contempt, I have been moving cattle across this territory for 15 years. You have been moving cattle across grassland for 15 years, Alice said. This is now a town. The legal distinction matters. Morrison looked at her for a long moment. She met his gaze without particular hostility but without any yielding. Your husband knows I am here, he said. My husband knows I am handling this, she said. Which is the same thing. Morrison left. His herd went north of Gentry, adding 12 miles to his drive, which cost him something but not enough to justify the legal fight that Alice had made very clear he would face if he persisted. He did not try again. Albert, when she told him, was quiet for a moment and then said, You have become genuinely fearsome, you know. Good, she said. He smiled, the full and genuine version that she still chased, still felt like a personal triumph when she produced it. Through the 1880s, the town grew. A doctor arrived in 1885, a young man named Hensley Fresh from a medical school in Missouri, who had come west for the same reason many young men came west, which was that the East was full and the West was not, and who became, over the years, one of the most important people in the community's life. He was the one who helped Alice through her 3rd pregnancy in 1886, which was harder than the first 2, and which gave them a 2nd son they named William, who arrived in the world impatient and loud and was, Albert said with deep private happiness, very like his mother. William was 6 weeks old when Alice was back at the town council meetings. Albert held the baby on the porch of the council building while she was inside arguing for the funding of a proper water trough and wash facility at the town's main street, a public health measure that Dr. Hensley had been advocating and that Alice had turned into a formal proposal. And afterward, when she came out to find him in the late afternoon light with the baby asleep against his chest, she thought she had never in her life seen anything more beautiful. You argued for the trough, he said. And got it, she said. Of course you did, he said, and the warmth in his voice was so complete that she pressed herself against his side, the baby between them, and they stood like that for a moment on the porch with the town that bore her name spread out in the evening light around them. The late 1880s brought the kind of troubles that mature settlements face, the political ones, the economic ones, the ones that come not from hostile weather or hostile men, but from the complex machinery of a community trying to govern itself fairly when the people in it have different interests and different visions. There were disputes about the school curriculum. Alice chaired 3 separate committee meetings on this subject, which she privately found more exhausting than any cattle dispute. There were disagreements about the direction of the main commercial street and what kinds of businesses should be permitted, which involved a protracted argument about the saloon that had opened in 1884 and that Alice had complicated feelings about. She was not a prohibitionist by temperament, believing as she did in personal liberty, but the practical effects of certain establishments on certain families were visible and real. And she had helped 3 women whose husbands had become serious problems apply for the limited legal protections available to them, which were inadequate, and which she wrote about in letters to county representatives. The injustice of what women could and could not do legally was something she had known about intellectually since her own land dispute in 1873, but the years of living in a community and watching its smallest and largest workings had made this knowledge no longer intellectual. She saw it in concrete terms, in the women who had no legal claim to property they had worked, in the children who depended on mothers who had no formal authority over their own circumstances. She wrote letters about these things and signed her name to petitions about these things and argued at county meetings about these things, and most of the time she was heard politely and the concrete changes were modest, which was the pace of change and she knew it, but she did not stop. Albert supported all of this with the same steadiness with which he supported everything she did, which was the kind of active, present support that did not just agree but asked questions and provided information, and showed up when she needed a second person behind her. He was not a political man in the way she was. He was more private, more inclined to individual action than collective advocacy, but he understood exactly what she was doing and why, and he believed in it, and that mattered. In 1890, Gentry, Kansas was incorporated as a proper municipality. There was a formal election for mayor and council. Alice was nominated for the council by 4 separate community members and elected by a margin that surprised no one who knew the town. She was the only woman on the council, which she noted with the particular dryness she had developed over 17 years on the frontier. She also noted it to the county representative at the first council meeting, and she continued to note it at regular intervals. She was 40 years old and she felt it in her hands most mornings, the decades of work in them, the cold and the labor. But she felt strong in the way that people feel strong when they have built their strength from the ground rather than been given it, a deep structural strength that had its roots in something real. Thomas, their oldest, was 13 and already showing the particular combination of his parents' qualities that made Albert laugh privately and Alice watch with close attention. Her father's steadiness and her mother's drive, directed currently toward learning to ride better than anyone in his class at school, and competing in every physical challenge the territory offered. Clara was 8 and reading everything she could find, which in Gentry in 1890 meant the school's small library, Alice's own considerable collection of books, and the contents of the periodicals that came in on the mail wagon. William was 4 and had opinions about everything and communicated them loudly and without reservation to anyone who would listen, which was everyone. Albert and Alice were, by 1890, the settled kind of married that is the furthest thing from boring, the kind that is so thoroughly known and so genuinely seen that it produces a richness rather than a sameness. They disagreed regularly and well. They made each other laugh. They still reached for each other in the night with the same intention they had always had, and the prairie years and the children and the weight of all the work had not diminished this, but had layered it with everything they had lived through together, which made it deeper and more real. He brought her wildflowers sometimes, the ones that grew in the spring along the creek, not because it was grand gesture, but because he noticed them and thought of her. She read aloud to him on winter evenings from whatever book she was working through, and he listened with his eyes half closed and asked questions that proved he had been paying closer attention than he appeared. They had the particular vocabulary of long-married people, the shorthand of reference and joke that was both intimate and practical. "You are still remarkable," he told her one evening in 1891, sitting on their covered porch watching the sunset that was doing something extraordinary over the western horizon, as the Kansas sky in September is inclined to do. "You are still saying that," she said. "I will keep saying it until you believe it," he said. I believe in the work, she said. I know, he said. That is part of what is remarkable. She turned to look at him. This man who had been her neighbor and her friend and her love and her husband and her partner in everything for 16 years, who was 50 years old now and wore his years in the way men who have lived honestly tend to, with a kind of settled gravity and warmth, and whose dark eyes were as direct and kind as they had been the first day she rode up to his barn. Albert, she said. Yes, he said. I love you, she said, not because they did not say it, but because sometimes a person needs to say the thing simply, without occasion. I love you, he said, with the same simplicity. The sun took a long time going down, and they stayed on the porch until it was completely gone. The 1890s were the years of their children growing up, and the town growing more complex, and the land continuing its patient work of producing things in exchange for care. Thomas, at 15, rode his first cattle drive north and came back 2 inches taller and considerably more serious, and with a deep love for the trail that was entirely his own, and which his parents recognized without trying to shape. He was going to be a cattleman, and the knowledge of this settled into the family like a familiar weather pattern, comfortable and right. Albert began teaching him the ranch management in earnest, not as inheritance but as craft, the way Albert had always treated everything he knew. Clara, at 11, announced that she intended to be a doctor. She said this at the supper table with the absolute conviction of someone making a statement of fact rather than a declaration of ambition. Albert put his fork down and looked at Alice, and Alice looked at Clara and said, "Then you will need to study mathematics and biology beyond what the school here offers, and we will need to order additional materials." "I know," Clara said. "I already have a list." She produced the list. It was written in her precise small handwriting on a page she had torn from a notebook. Alice looked at it, and then at Albert, and something passed between them that Clara did not quite understand, but that had something to do with recognition. "Your list is good," Albert told Clara. "Your mother will help you source what you need." Clara nodded, satisfied, and picked up her fork again. Alice and Albert held each other's gaze for another moment across the supper table, both of them thinking the same thing in the companionable way of parents who know each other well. William, at 7, burned down a section of the corral fence by accident while conducting what he described as a scientific experiment involving fire, which he had not discussed with anyone prior to conducting it. The relevant conversation afterward was long and eventually productive, in the sense that it established certain parameters for future scientific inquiry that were generally observed, more or less. In 1893, a long dry spell that began in early spring and extended through August tested the town's water infrastructure seriously. The aquifer below Sallow Creek, which had been the settlement's primary water source since the early days, was under strain from the increased population of the town and the dryness of the season. Alice had been watching the water levels since June, tracking them in the same careful ledger she used for everything, and by July she was concerned. She went to see Albert, who had been tracking his own well, and they compared notes at the kitchen table. "We need a second source," Alice said. "The Hennessy claim has a spring on the north edge," Albert said. "It has not dried yet." "Can we negotiate a shared pipe?" she said. He considered. "Hennessy will want something." "Hennessy wants his Northfield fenced, and the town has been delaying that approval," Alice said. "I will bring it to council." The council approved the fence. Hennessy agreed to the shared water access. Albert supervised the pipe construction himself, working with the town's 2 hired laborers and Tom Connors, the fiddle player turned farmer turned community mainstay, to run a pipe from the spring to a central town cistern. It was finished in 2 weeks and held for the rest of the dry summer, and the town's water supply remained stable. At the council meeting where she reported this outcome, a newer member named Garrett, who had only been in Gentry for 3 years and who had the particular confidence of someone who had not been there for the hard early years, said, "It seems like an awful lot of effort and expense for one dry season." Alice looked at him. "When the next dry season comes," she said, "you will understand why we built the infrastructure this one." The dry season came again in 1895. The cistern held. Garrett did not comment. Thomas married in 1896, a girl from a ranching family north of Caldwell named Ruth Harmon, who was 21 to Thomas's 19, and had been corresponding with him for 2 years before they met in person, which was the kind of courtship that the distances of the prairie produced. Alice liked Ruth from the first meeting. She was direct and warm and had a practical intelligence that reminded Alice, she said privately to Albert afterward, of someone she had known many years ago. "You mean yourself," Albert said. "I might," Alice said. Albert smiled. "Good, our son needs that." The wedding was in Gentry, and it was a proper celebration. The whole town in attendance, and dancing that lasted past midnight, and Alice danced with Albert more than 3 times, which was, she noted, considerably better than their wedding. He was a more practiced dancer by now, though still earnest about it, and they moved together in the firelight with Thomas and Ruth laughing nearby and Clara, 14 and already formidably serious, standing at the edge of the gathering watching everything with her calm assessing eyes, and William, 10, currently engaged in whatever it was that William was always engaged in that required the adults nearby to occasionally check on him. In the last years of the 19th century, Gentry, Kansas became fully established. It had a population by the 1900 census of 312 people. It had 2 churches, a school with 3 teachers, a general store, a hardware store, a doctor's office, a livery stable, a blacksmith, a post office in a proper building now rather than Albert's barn, and a council chamber that had been built on the main street in 1895. Alice had been on the town council for a decade and had served as council chair for 5 of those years, which was an informal position but a real one. She had written and revised the town's foundational ordinances. She had negotiated with the county on property taxes and water rights and road maintenance. She had established the school's first formal library fund, which she had seeded with her own money, and supplemented through a community subscription drive she organized herself. She had helped pass an ordinance that required all land sales in Gentry to include spousal notification, which was a small thing legally but a significant one practically for the women of the town. She was 50 years old. She did not feel old exactly, but she felt the weight of time, which is different, not a burden but a substance, the accumulated matter of lived years that gives a person density. Albert was 57. His hair had gone fully silver, and he was still lean and still moved with the same unhurried precision, and she still caught herself watching him sometimes the way she had in those early years when she was trying not to admit what she felt. He had sold most of the cattle operation in the late 1890s, keeping a smaller herd of good quality rather than managing the larger numbers that required constant driving, and he put his energy into the town with more intention, serving on the water committee, managing the post office, which he still officially held even after the town had grown too large for a barn, being one of the people anyone in Gentry knew they could go to for practical assistance of the kind that required both skill and reliability. He was, Alice thought, the same man she had met in the spring of 1873, and also entirely different, and she loved both versions completely. "You have been looking at me," he said one evening, catching her watching him from across the room. "I am allowed," she said. "You are absolutely allowed," he agreed. "You have looked at me that way for 25 years. I still never know what it means." "It means," she said, "that I am glad I rode north to your ranch that first day." He put down what he was holding and came to where she was standing and took her face in his hands, which were still warm and calloused and sure, and he kissed her in the direct and unhurried way that was entirely his, and she put her hands against his chest and felt his heartbeat and thought, with the quiet completeness of a person who has everything they need, yes. Clara Wilcox left for Wichita in 1900 to begin her formal medical studies at the age of 18. She had been preparing for this specifically and methodically for 7 years, since the night she produced her list at the supper table, and she was the most rigorously prepared student to have come out of the Gentry school, which was saying something. She had also, in the previous 2 years, been apprenticing informally with Dr. Hensley, who had told Alice privately that Clara had better clinical instincts at 17 than some of his colleagues with degrees. Alice and Albert drove her to the Caldwell stage in September. Clara, 18 years old and entirely composed, kissed her parents goodbye with the specific warmth of someone who loves deeply, but is not delayed by sentiment. "I will write," she said. "You had better," Alice said. "Write your mother more than you think is necessary," Albert said. "She will think it is still not enough, but she will not say so." Clara looked at her father with precise recognition. "I know," she said, and the corner of her mouth lifted, and she boarded the stage. They drove back to Gentry in the early morning quiet. Alice did not cry until they were past the edge of town, and then she did briefly and completely, and Albert put his arm around her on the wagon seat, and she let herself lean against him while the morning opened up around them. "She will be exceptional," he said. "I know," Alice said. "I know that." "Then why are you crying?" "Because she is my daughter," Alice said, "and she is getting on a stage to go be exceptional somewhere else. Both things are true at the same time." He held her closer. William, 14 in 1900, had grown into a young man of considerable intelligence and restless energy, which he had by this time channeled primarily into mechanical things. He was fascinated by engines and machinery, and spent considerable time corresponding with a cousin in Indianapolis who worked with the emerging automobile industry. He was going to leave Gentry too, eventually, for something technological and urban, and Alice had accepted this with the equanimity of a woman who had long ago decided that her children's lives were theirs to lead. Thomas and Ruth had given them a grandchild in 1899, a boy named Albert, who went by Bert to distinguish him from his grandfather, and who had the Gentry eyes and the Wilcox temperament, and was, at 1 year old, already showing signs of independent opinion. Alice held Bert and felt the particular joy of grandparenthood, which is parental love without the terror, the complete pleasure of a small person without the full weight of responsibility for them. The new century came on a quiet January morning in 1901, and Gentry, Kansas welcomed it with a gathering in the council chamber that had been Alice's suggestion. Not a grand event, but a real one, the whole town present, the school children singing, a brief address from the council, and then a meal that lasted 3 hours and included dancing that Connors, now 60 and with a back that gave him trouble in cold weather but whose fiddle hand was as good as it had ever been, led with his usual enthusiasm. Albert and Alice danced. He was better than he used to be. She told him so. "I have had 25 years of practice," he said. "You have had 25 years of practice and still insist on that particular hop on the 4 count," she said. "That is not a hop," he said. "That is style." She laughed against his shoulder. In 1903, 30 years after Alice had first arrived in Caldwell on the southbound stage with her carpetbag and her surveyor's map, the County Historical Society published its first formal history of the southwestern Kansas territories. There was a chapter on the town of Gentry, and it included a summary of the towns, founding that Alice read with the slight discomfort of a person reading about themselves. Not because it was wrong, but because it was formal and summarizing, and could not contain what the experience had actually been. The tent in the first winter, the post-hole mornings with Albert, the October night when he had finally said what both of them had known, the fires and the droughts and the disputes, the births and the councils and the ordinances and the letters and the years. The historical account noted, among other things, that Alice Gentry Wilcox had been one of the earliest settlers of the Sallow Creek region and had been instrumental in the development of the town. It did not say, because historical records are not in the business of saying personal things, that she had been told she would not last a season. She thought about that, sitting at her kitchen table reading the slim pamphlet on a quiet afternoon in March with sunlight coming in the window, and a pot of something on the stove, and the sounds of the town outside her door. The sounds of 300 people living their lives in a place that had not existed 30 years ago. Albert came in from the post office, which he still managed 3 mornings a week because he said that at 59 he was not prepared to stop being useful, and he poured himself coffee and sat down across from her. "Reading your history," he said, nodding at the pamphlet. "Our history," she said. "Your name is on the town," he said. "Our name is on the town," she said. "Both of ours." He looked at her. "I believe the legal registration says Gentry." "And Gentry was a name I had from a man who brought me to this place," she said, "and a name I kept because it was mine. But this town was built by both of us, and you know it." He regarded her across the table with the dark, steady eyes that had changed nothing in 30 years except to grow more familiar, more completely known, and still somehow not less remarkable to her. "All right," he said, in the tone he used when he conceded a point that he was glad to concede. She set the pamphlet down. "Do you know what I remember most clearly?" she said. "Of all of it." "Tell me," he said. "The night you rode south to wait on my porch," she said. "When I came back from Caldwell after the land dispute, you were just sitting there with your hat on your knee. I did not know then exactly what that meant, but I felt it." "I was not sure what it meant either," he said. "At that point." "When did you know?" she asked. "The winter," he said. "That first winter, when the temperature went a 15 below and I spent 2 days worrying about whether your wood supply would last. I knew then." She had not known it had been the first winter. She had thought it was later. "You never said," she said. "No," he said. "Because you had buried a husband 6 months earlier, and because I thought if I said anything before you were ready I would lose you. And losing you was the one thing I could not tolerate." She looked at this man she had known for 30 years and loved for almost that long, and she thought about the patience it took to feel a thing that fully and hold it quietly until the moment was right. And she thought about how every choice that had led her here, the map on her father's table, the horse in the Caldwell livery, the decision to ride north to her neighbor's barn, had been right, not in spite of the difficulty but through it. "Albert," she said. "Yes," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for waiting." He reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb moving slowly over her knuckles in the way he had always done, and outside the kitchen window the March light moved over the town of Gentry, Kansas, and the prairie that lay beyond it stretched out as it always had, enormous and clean and full of possibility. "I was not waiting," he said. "I was just being where you were." Clara returned from Wichita in 1904 as a fully credentialed physician. She was 22 years old and the second woman in Kansas to hold a medical certificate, and she returned to Gentry not because she had been asked to, but because she had decided to. She had received offers in Wichita and had turned them down, which she explained to her parents at the kitchen table with the same matter-of-fact directness she had produced her list at 11 years old. "There are 300 people in Gentry who need a doctor," she said. "Dr. Hensley is 58 and has been working alone for 19 years. The nearest other physician is 40 miles away. The decision is not complicated." "The decision may not be complicated," Alice said. "But I want you to know that I will tell you honestly if I think you have made it for the wrong reasons." Clara looked at her. "What would the wrong reasons be?" "Obligation to family," Alice said. "Wanting to stay close rather than wanting to do the work. Settling." "I am not settling," Clara said, with an edge of her father's quiet certainty. "I chose this." Alice looked at her daughter, this composed and brilliant young woman who had her father's eyes and her mother's will and something entirely her own layered through both, and felt a satisfaction so deep it was almost quiet. "Then welcome home," Alice said. Clara took over the practice from Dr. Hensley in a formal handover in 1905, when Hensley retired to his daughter's farm in Missouri. She was 23 years old and the only physician for a significant portion of southwestern Kansas, and she worked with the methodical competence and occasional iron, well, that anyone who had watched her grow up would have found entirely unsurprising. In the same year, William left Gentry for Indianapolis, where he had found a position with a manufacturing firm developing motorized vehicles. He was 19 and vibrating with energy, and Alice held him at the door for longer than he expected, and he let her, because under all that restlessness he was still her son. "You will write," she said. "More than you think is necessary," he said, grinning, with the memory of the same words applied to his sister 5 years earlier, and she could not help laughing even with the ache of it. He sent long, enthusiastic letters. The first one arrived 6 days after he left and described his rooming house, his employer, his colleagues, the noise of the city, and a motorized vehicle he had been permitted to examine up close, in detail that ran to 4 pages. Alice read every word. Thomas and Ruth had a second child in 1903, a daughter they named Alice. The elder Alice had held her baby granddaughter and looked at the small, sleeping face and felt the circularity of things. This new Alice who would grow up in the town that bore her name, this little person who had the whole of the frontier ahead of her and every door that the women before her had labored to open just a fraction wider. "She has your stubborn chin," Albert had said, looking over her shoulder at the baby. "That is not stubborn," Alice said. "That is determined." "The distinction has always been thin in this family," Albert said, and she heard the smile in his voice and leaned back against him with the baby warm in her arms. The years continued in their full and honest way. Albert's health remained good into his mid-60s, though he moved with slightly more deliberate care and occasionally felt the old cold in his hands on winter mornings. Alice at 60 was still formidable on the council and had been re-elected council chair 3 times, and she was still writing letters to county and state representatives about the things that needed to be changed, and some of those letters were having effects now, slow and cumulative and real. In 1908, Kansas passed a law allowing women to vote in municipal elections. Alice sat in her kitchen with the newspaper and read the announcement and was quiet for a long time. Albert came in and saw her expression. "Good news," he said. She handed him the paper. He read it. He put it down. "About time," he said. 35 years overdue," she said. "But yes." She voted in the Gentry municipal election that November with Clara beside her, the two of them walking to the polling place in the morning. And when she handed in her ballot, she felt the weight of the years behind this small specific action. The land dispute and the Morrison cattle confrontation and the council chair and the ordinances and the letters and the 35 years of making a life on this particular piece of earth that was now a town. She walked out of the polling place into the November morning, and Albert was waiting on the step outside, which she had not expected. "You did not vote," she said. "I voted this morning before you came," he said. "I thought I would walk back with you." She took his arm and they walked back through the town together, past the school where they could hear children inside at their lessons, past the general store where Hester Marshall's daughter Hester herself was gone now. 5 years gone, which was a grief that Alice had carried carefully, was arranging a window display, past the council chamber and the post office and Clara's medical practice, and the church and the blacksmith. Through all the streets of the small town that had grown from a dry creek bed, and a dead man's claim, and a stubborn woman's refusal to be smaller than the land required. They walked in the fall morning light, and they did not need to say anything, because they had spent 35 years learning each other's silences, and this one was full and right. In the spring of 1913, 40 years after Alice had ridden into the Kansas territory on a brown mare named Patience, she planted a tree in the town square of Gentry, Kansas. It was an oak, grown from a sapling she had ordered from a nursery in Topeka, and it would not be large in her lifetime, but it would be large eventually, and it would last longer than any of them, which was rather the point. She was 63 years old. Albert stood beside her with a shovel and helped position the root ball in the hole that Thomas had dug that morning. Clara was there, and Thomas and Ruth, and their children young Albert, who was 14 now and Syriacide, and young Alice 10, who was asking questions about the oak's growth rate and expected lifespan that Clara was answering with the patient precision she brought to everything scientific. William had come home from Indianapolis for a 2-week visit, older now, 30 years old, with grease under his fingernails that no amount of washing fully removed, and a joy for the mechanical world that had not diminished. He stood at the edge of the small gathering with his hands in his pockets and a smile on his face that looked so much like his father's that it made Alice's chest ache with love. The tree went in. Thomas packed soil around the base. Alice poured the first bucket of water. She stood back and looked at the small tree with its tender new leaves catching the spring light, and she looked at the town around it, the buildings and the streets and the people going about their days, and she felt, in the fullness of that moment, the entire span of it. The woman who had stepped off a stage with a carpetbag and a map, and who had been told she would not last a season. Albert's hand found hers. 40 years, he said. And then some, she said. What does it feel like, he said. Honestly, she thought about this the way she thought about things that deserved honest consideration. It feels like home, she said. The whole of it, the hard years and the good years and the building and the worrying and the people and the work. All of it feels like the thing I was supposed to do with this life. He squeezed her hand. I knew that about you, he said, the day you rode up to my barn. You could not have known that, she said. You had never met me. I could see it, he said. The way you sat in that saddle, the way you answered questions. I thought, this woman is going to be exactly what she comes here to be. She looked at him, this man who had been at her side for 4 decades, whose silver hair caught the spring light and whose hands were still warm and whose eyes were still exactly the same, direct and kind and entirely sure of her. You thought all that the first day, she said. I thought most of that the first day, he said. The rest I figured out over supper. She laughed, and Clara looked over and smiled at the sound of it, and young Bert said, What is funny? And William said, Grandmother is funny, which you would know if you paid attention. And Thomas said something to Ruth in the low voice of long marriages, and Ruth laughed, and young Alice was still asking Clara about oak trees. And the spring morning held all of them in the town that Alice had built and Albert had helped her build. The town that had been a dry creek bed and a land claim, and a woman who refused to leave. That evening they sat on their porch as they had sat on so many evenings, the covered porch facing south that Alice had wanted since her first year on this land. The family had dispersed, Thomas and Ruth to their own house on the north end of the ranch property, Clara to her practice, William and the grandchildren to the guest rooms, and the house was quiet in the companionable way it had been quiet for years. The sky was doing extraordinary things again, as the Kansas sky reliably did, layering orange and pink and the particular deep blue of a spring evening across the western horizon in a display that never in 40 years had entirely lost its power to stop her. Albert, she said. Yes, he said. I want to tell you something. All right, he said in the tone of a man who had been listening carefully to this woman for 40 years and intended to continue. When I left Cincinnati, she said, I did not know if I was brave or foolish or simply unwilling to accept the smaller life. I still do not entirely know which it was. Does it matter, he said. Not to the outcome, she said, but I think about it sometimes. What drove me? I know what drove you, Albert said. Tell me, she said. You saw something true about yourself, he said, and you refused to let anyone talk you out of it. That is neither brave nor foolish. That is just clarity. She was quiet for a moment. You have the gift, she said, of saying the exact right thing. I have the gift of knowing you well enough to say true things, he said. You gave me the 40 years to learn. The sun finished its descent and the stars began to appear. One and then several and then all at once in the density, the Kansas sky produced when the last light was fully gone. And they sat in the dark on the porch they had built together, in the house they had built together, in the town that bore her name. And the prairie lay around them in the dark the same way it had lain around her that very first night in a tent on a raw land claim in the spring of 1873, enormous, honest. indifferent to small fears, the whole of it available to anyone willing to stay. She was 63 years old. She had been called too headstrong to last a season on the frontier. She had lasted 40 years. She had built a town. She had raised 3 remarkable children and begun to know their children. She had loved a man with the fullness of herself and been loved by him with the same fullness. Across every season the frontier had produced, across every difficulty and joy and ordinary Tuesday and extraordinary crisis, and they were sitting on their porch in the dark, and they were still, in the most complete and specific sense of the word, together. She leaned against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. "Still glad you came," he said. "Every day of 40 years," she said, "every single one." The stars blazed overhead in the town of Gentry. Kansas made its quiet evening sounds all around them. Someone's dog, a window closing, the distant sound of a child being called in, the sounds of people living their lives in a place that had been made for them, imperfectly and stubbornly and with enormous love, by a woman who had been told she would not last. She had lasted. She had built something that would last longer than her, longer than any of them, reaching forward into the years the way the oak tree in the town square reached upward into the light slowly, certainly, rooted in everything that had already been given. Albert pulled her closer. She felt his heartbeat against her cheek. "Thank you," she said quietly to him and to the night and to the 40 years of it. "Thank you," he said back and held her, and the stars turned slowly overhead, and the prairie breathed around them, and the town that bore her name settled into the peaceful dark of a spring evening in Kansas in 1913, complete and whole and hers.